an anteater. Are there any anteaters around here? I've always wondered about the anteaters at UCI, but anyway. So he's done some fascinating research, and as I said earlier, he started out as an engineer doing software for the fabulous Patriot missile system that was used back in Gulf One. So, without any further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Krichmar.
Got a mic here. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for inviting me. Never heard of the Inside Edge before. This is a great group, so I'm glad I actually got a chance to meet you. Yes, so as Patrick said, I'm a professor here on campus. I've been here a little under 3 years, and I have I guess it seems like a long past now of a lot of software engineering, and then I got very interested in how the brain works, and I wanted to put together the ideas of what I learned from software engineering with what I wanted to learn about how the brain works and how we actually think. And so it got me on this path to actually put together computer science, neuroscience, and robotics. And probably a lot of you aren't familiar with any of these topics, so ask questions. Well, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask. No questions are dumb questions. So why do I do this? I want to model the mind. So really, we're not trying to make a Terminator. we would like to make friendly robots, but really what I'm using the robots is for a tool to understand how the mind works. And so the best way to understand something is to build it. Try and build it yourself, reverse engineer. If you could build it yourself, then you'd understand all the parts. And so there's people in this field that actually try modeling the mind. But I feel that strongly that you can't just model the mind. Our brains don't work like in a vacuum. They actually are closely coupled to what our body's telling us. So we call this sometimes synthetic methodology, actually building physical devices and running experiments with them like you would with a person or an animal. And there's a flip side, and a lot of people have gotten interested in this, is that these types of machines, once they get really good, actually could have all sorts of interesting applications. And I'm not a good person in marketing. I'll never be rich, I don't think. But you could imagine these things have applications, and we've talked about military, but health care for doing jobs in construction or transportation, things where there's high risk. There's a lot of applications out there that are waiting for machines that are smart, that actually can do a little thinking on their own so they can handle some of these tough jobs we can't do anymore. Okay. Anyone ever heard of Moore's Law? No. Okay. Moore's Law, Gordon Moore, I think, is the founder of Intel computers, and he predicted that very nicely that every few years the power of computers would double. And that is this line here from the first computer in the 50s, following up, the old Macintosh to around now. This line has been quite nicely following this curve that he predicted. And there's a person named Ray Kurzweil. You ever heard of him? Yeah, and he's got this notion of called the singularity. I'll say I have read a few of his books and papers. I'm not a huge fan, but he has this idea of the singularity that if you follow this Moore's Law, in about 2023, we'll have computers that are as smart as human brains. And then he goes on to predict that shortly thereafter, you'll have computers that are as smart as all the human brains in the world, and then they'll get, in his mind, they get bored. The machines get bored and computers get bored with the Earth. It's not interesting, so they leave the humans alone and then go off into the universe. Now, I shouldn't be mean to Kurzweil. Kurzweil is a very smart person. He invented Kurzweil synthesizers. He's been very influential. So he is a real smart person and an expert. But that is one of the, in my field, one of the things I'm always asked is when is the singularity? And I want to give a little kind of straw man example. So a number of years ago, it's almost been 20 years, IBM made a computer called Deep Blue that actually could play a really good game of chess. And the IBM engineers challenged Garry Kasparov, who was the world chess champion at the time. In a series of seminal matches, this computer beat Gary Kasparov. And then they say, oh my gosh, the singularity is near. You know, we've got we've got computers that are far more intelligent than any person. Gary Kasparov, you know, the pinnacle of intelligence, is playing a good game of chess. And then I ran across this this cartoon. So this really drives home, I think, an important point, and a point that a lot of people are trying to make, you know, intelligent machines or artificial intelligence have missed over the years. Is it takes a whole cast of characters to keep the computer running. There's a whole team of IBM engineers, programmers, and you need outside power source. And what Deep Blue can't even do, they have to have an IBM engineer actually move the pieces. You can get a 4-year-old child to move the chess pieces nice and smooth. You can't get a computer or a robot to do that right now. So there's some real challenges that we've missed. So I think this really misses the point. And if I had a mission statement for my lab, it would be this: the brain is embodied, the body is embedded in the environment. So the brains don't work in isolation. They need a body. And the more I look at this and think about it, I think that body is actually telling the brain what to do, not the other way around. But then the body and brain don't work very well unless you're in an environment. So we're very tuned to our environment and extensions of our environment like this, or my phone in my pocket. So how we actually take information in and how we act on the world and change the world makes a huge difference. And so I think you have to look at the whole picture to really get at what's intelligence. And if you're looking at brains, you have to look inside the brain and how the brain is wired up. Yeah. And so the brain has a lot of what we like to call specialists in there, and it doesn't look like this. Actually, I was trained as a computer scientist, and I took a course in neuroscience just as an elective when I was in grad school, and it was daunting, all the anatomical areas, and I had to get the human brain coloring book. This is actually an actual book. This is what got me through neuroanatomy class in grad school, because I was with all these pre-meds who could remember every track that was Latin with some weird Latin name. But the brain, first of all, human brain is huge. It's got 100 billion neurons, so the actual working cells in the brain. Many more times than that, a bunch of cells that support those 100 billion cells. And then it's got what's known as synaptic connections, so the wiring in the brain. So there's 10 to the 15, so write a 10 and then 15 zeros, 10 to the 15 connections in the human brain. So it's huge. From a network standpoint, it's an incredibly largest network probably that we've ever studied. But there is a lot of order here. So by a freak of evolution, your eyes are here, but your visual processing is back here. This area in blue is actually an area that's very important for memory and hearing, music. That's why there's this piano here. This area here, the parietal, is very important for spatial awareness, mathematics, things like that. And then this area in the front, in the yellow frontal lobe, which is really expanded in the humans and primates, is important for planning, decision making, dealing with how to get rewards and penalties and things like that. So a lot of specialists, but with all of those connections, they're not separate modules. They're all talking to each other. There's a lot of interaction talking. And again, the structure is really important. So I think what is the most important thing about the brain is how it's wired up in the different areas. Okay. So now I want to make a robot that incorporates all these principles. And so how would I do that? Well, first, I want to have this robot have a brain. And like I said, I want to have the dynamics, so the way the brain is changing from time to time, but also how it's hooked up. So it actually is sort of wired like a real brain. And I need it to actually learn on its own. So all of our models, we give it some little starter, like a kid has a starter where they know sort of what's good or bad. Something's hot, they'll take their hand away. If something's sweet, you put it on their tongue, they'll smile. Something's kind of tart, you'll put it on the kid's tongue, it'll make a pucker face. So it has a bunch of little innate reflexes, but then it has to learn all of the things on its own. So it has to learn, what's a chair, what's a table. Most animals don't have language, so they do this without labels. So so we have to figure out a way to do that. And we also have to figure out a way to change the behavior when something important happens. All right, so if something important happens and is good, you want to do that again. If something important happens and is bad, you better not ever do that again. You got one chance. So you want to be able to figure out how to change and based on what's happening in your world. So all of our robots have these aspects. And what's nice about this, it makes a wonderful tool for understanding the brain because you've built this whole brain, so you have access to the whole brain and you can see all its parts. And then there's this whole world of data out there with animals and humans that you can actually compare the robot's behavior with the human and animal behavior. And also you can peer into its brain and see, well, is it brain acting like a real brain? So I think it's a wonderful, powerful tool to help us understand what makes us us and what makes us intelligent. Okay, so some examples. This is a typical setup on the upper left. So there's one of my older robots, and he's doing a classic test of looking at different patterns and picking one out of a crowd. So on one wall, there's diamonds. On another wall, there's different colored squares and so on. And you see these little twinkling lights. I'll talk more about this, but those are neurons in his brain. So we're actually showing what his brain's doing as he's doing some behavior. And so that's the nice setup. This is, on the upper right, another robot that actually is doing a task that they do for classic task for memory in rats, which is called the Morris water maze. And so if this was a rat, you put him in a tank of water, and the water would be kind of milky white, and the rat would swim around. Rats are very good swimmers, but they hate being in the water, so they're quite motivated to get out. And somewhere beneath the water, in this case over here for us, is a platform that the rat just finds by random chance. And now you see our robot, after several trials, in this dry version of this maze, is now finding its way to that spot. Makes a little mistake, but then he quickly corrects himself, and now he's found it. And so we modeled the same area of the brain in the rat that actually helps do this behavior and showed that you could do this in a robot and made some predictions of how a rat's doing that. And so we've been asked to take some of our robots outside the lab and see what they could do in the real world. This is a crazy one that my friends Donald Hudson and Brian Cox made. And it's a robot, I hope you can see it, but it's a robot that could go forward, and it has wheels like rollerblade wheels. So it can go forward, it can turn, it can slide back and forth. So very difficult to control. So we made a model of the area of the brain that actually controls fine motor movements called the cerebellum. And much to Donald's dismay, the first 30 minutes it was crashing into everything. And it learned from its mistakes to smooth out those movements and learned when to slow down, when to turn, and turn what was awkward crashing movements into nice, smooth movements. And then we were asked, at some point in this period of time, this says 2005, the one on the right's later, but we were asked to put all these things together and get in a competition to play robotic soccer. So this is a robot built on a Segway platform, and this is our team. That's our robot. That's Donald, who's his teammate, and we're playing in the U.S. Open Robotic Soccer Championships versus Carnegie Mellon. And so our robot had the ability to recognize things with its brain, make decisions, not collide into things, make plans. And here's a nice example of a decision-making, a give-and-go play. Passes to Donald, so he recognizes Donald, looks towards the goal, gets in position, is able to catch a pass back, and then now he's got a decision to make. He can either shoot or he can pass back to Donald. And he realizes that there's a little area there that he can fit a ball in and gets a goal. So this is a 300-pound robot on two wheels balancing, very unstable and inexpensive to operate. So our Carnegie Mellon and us were the only ones that fielded teams, and then we won every series we played against Carnegie Mellon, and then people said, this is just too much to do. And so this league went defunct, and so now we're reigning world champions, I guess, of Segway soccer for what it's worth. But this is an active area. There are actually international championships of robotic soccer that are very popular, and hopefully one day UC Irvine will field a team. I've been trying to get students interested. Yeah. Well, their mission statement is by 2050 to have a team of robots actually beat the World Cup team. And I can tell you right now, I don't think it's going to happen. We've got a long way to go, but I think it'll be interesting what's out there in 2050. Okay, so I'm going to talk some current work and just give you a flavor of kind of how we put this together. And raise your hand or wave at me if I get too technical. I try not to get too technical, but I want to give you sort of an idea of the brain science and how I actually walk through the steps. So I got very interested in the idea of how we get value from the world and what part of the brains actually allow us to extract value. And value is not only just good things. Value can be a lot of things, especially to an organism trying to survive. And I've looking through the literature and talking to people, I found that there are these areas of the brain called neuromodulatory systems. Very important for survival, very important for sort of setting your behavioral state, as they say, and also important for making decisions when you really have to make a decision. And this is your anatomy lesson for today. This is the human brain, sliced right down the middle. I think it's called a sagittal slice, for those of you who want to know. And what I found interesting about these neuromodulatory systems is this whole twisted, folded area is the cortex, the neocortex, for new cortex. And below that are these areas that deal with value, neuromodulatory systems. And like I said, the human brain has about 100 billion neurons. But in these very important areas that are below the cortex here, they have on the order of 1 million neurons to tens of thousands of neurons, very small. But you look at these arrows, and this is where what I'll say is project. So they send a broadcast signal to all areas of the brain and force the brain to make a very big change very quickly. So very important things. And when you say they're subcortical and on the brain stem or midbrain, that means they've been around for a long time, evolutionarily. So important, all have the same kind of, like I said, the anatomy is very important, so they all have the same kind of structure. So what are they doing? I thought was very interesting. So looking a little deeper, I tried to make a wiring diagram of how they're connected, and it looks like a mess, doesn't it? But in gold are these value systems and neuromodulatory systems, and in blue are these areas that I would say are important for cognitive function. They're important for planning, decision-making, memories, emotion, striatum, basal ganglia, very important for decision-making and getting movements going, putting together nice movements. So these are very important areas, and these neuromodulatory systems send lots of connections to them. Not only that, but it works the other way. All of these send connections back to these areas. So there's this two-way street going on. So what do? Well, that raphe nucleus there is important. That's the source of serotonin, the chemical serotonin in your brain. So you've probably heard about serotonin. Prozac is a serotonin uptake inhibitor. So people who have mood disorders, they take Prozac and it increases the amount of serotonin in your system. So very important for mood, but also important for how you'll deal with costs or risks or social behavior. Basal forebrain has something called acetylcholine. Let's see, acetylcholine, when you go to the eye doctor, they put acetylcholine or some variant of acetylcholine in your eye to cause the pupils to dilate. But that chemical actually is all across your brain. And this seems to be very important when you have to ramp up your attention. You're in a situation where it's noisy. Let's say you're in a party, a noisy conversation. You actually would increase your acetylcholine levels or cholinergic levels so you can actually pay more attention to the conversation you want to have. And locus coeruleus, another drug, norepinephrine, which is a little bit related to adrenaline or epinephrine. And it's very important for dealing with surprises. So if something surprising happens, you can either ignore it, or if you had a lot of norepinephrine, this guy was very active, then you're surprised, go, oh, that's a surprise, I'm going to deal with it right now. So another important area. And then finally, these areas here, substantia nigra, ventral tegmental area, very important for dealing with reward. I want to seek reward in the world. I want things. It's not actually, it's interesting, it's not the liking of food, it's the actually wanting of food. There's two separate areas, which I found interesting. So there's an area that actually says, I really want to get my coffee and eggs and bacon right now. And then there's another area, once I got it, that actually is active when I'm enjoying it. So it's so interesting. But these areas now, as you can see, they're they have really important fundamental functions for us, and they're highly interweaved with areas of the brain that do what we would call cognitive things. Okay. I don't think I'll go too much into the neuromodulatory brain detail, but I want to show you at least one neuron trace for the heck of it, all right? So this is a recording, so people can actually put wires into the brain and record from brain cells, all right? And this is a recording from a cell that has the chemical norepinephrine, or noradrenergic cell. And if you, in this task, I think it was a rat, and there was a sound, and then the rat would push a lever if it heard the sound, and get a nice either food, or usually they give them chocolate. Chocolate or Cheerios is what rats work for. And so you see, when it was, yeah, believe it or not, I'll talk a little bit about an experiment my friends do. They live on Cheerios. So the sound comes on, and when the rat was doing this right, you see this very sharp burst of activity in this area of the brain. That's the area of the brain that deals with surprise. So he's like, oh, surprise, there's a sound, and I think that's going to mean I'm going to get food, and so he gets it. And the dotted lines below are when he didn't get it right. So the brain, that little cell is actually predictive of if he's going to do something right or wrong. And the same with another one. This is the area of the brain that's important for reward, dopamine, and you see the same profile there when actually this is a monkey now, a completely different task. A monkey is looking at a screen, and several light flashes, and then he actually moves his eye to the one that actually he'll get a juicy. Monkeys work for fruit juice, and so he actually flicks his eyes, gets a little fruit juice, and gets his reward. And you see the same kind of thing, that there's the lights come on, and there's this response when he's doing it right from this dopamine system. And then there's the movement right there. So these things are actually primed to doing really important decision making at a single cell level. And just for the heck of it, here's an equation. I swear that'll be your only equation for the day. We just made a simple model of, well, what's going on in this. And what happens, to make a long story longer, is that let's say you have two decisions to make, and I've made them E1 and E2, so two decisions to make. And so we try to model like what's happening, like at a very simple level, what's happening with these systems, what are they doing to neurons in a brain. And so here they are, there's not much activity in our neuromodulatory systems, and it's like it could be, if this was a race, you're like, oh, it could be E1, it could be E2, at any time I could choose one or the other. And then I turn this neuromodulatory system on right here where this arrow is, and bam, like the E2 actually says, oh, I've got to make a decision now, and takes off with it, and the other one drops off. So it really is like a knob that's in the brain that says, all right, it's time to actually do something. You got to make a decision, right or wrong. You got to make a decision because it's important. So it seems like the brain's way of actually being decisive. And so we have this working model. So there's different areas that are giving you what's threatening, what's rewarding, what's surprising, how much effort you want to put into things. And when they're on, it causes you to be decisive. And in behavioral theory, it's called exploitive. You're exploiting the situation. But that's not always a good thing. You know, sometimes it's good to explore the world and be curious. And so when these systems are tonically on, so that means they're on at a very low level. That if they're off, you'd actually be asleep. In fact, the levels go way down when you fall asleep. But if they're on and you're awake, but they're not really that active, you're exploratory, you're curious, you're not attentive, but you're learning about your world. So we think this is a nice little knob in the brain to deal with these kind of events and just kind of say, all right, I'm going to be really decisive now, or I'm going to be really curious, and it's important to do both. But it's also important to know when to do which. Okay? So that's the sort of background lesson. And now I'm going to show you a few stupid robot tricks that oh, how am I doing on time?
Doing great.
Okay.
20 minutes.
20, perfect. Yeah, just jump up and down like when it's 10 minutes away or so.
Signs, I'll take.
Oh, excellent. So we did all this background. So I've been here about 3 years, and before I had a 6-month period where I had just time to read, 6 months straight of reading. So I really thought about this a lot. And then we got to the lab and decided to test this out. And I came from my previous place in San Diego, the Neuroscience Institute, with Brian Cox, who's a fabulous engineer. And when I met Brian, just to give you a little side story, Brian worked in Hollywood, and he showed me, in his interview, he showed me this portfolio of every sci-fi movie. He made like the thing from Godzilla, he made something from Bicentennial Man, Starship Troopers. He was what's known as an animatronic engineer. And I said, well, why are you here? And he said, well, they're doing everything with computer graphics now, so I don't have as much work. So he wanted to continue doing robots. So Brian actually made Carl. So for whatever reason, and there really is, if you look it up, there's no reason why we're called the Anteaters, except it's a historical mistake of a bunch of water polo teammates said, we need a mascot, let's call it the Anteater. As far as I could tell, there's never been an Anteater in Southern California. And so we're the Cognitive Robotics Lab, so Anteater's our mascot, so we have Cognitive Anteater Robotics Lab, which makes the acronym CARL. And so this is CARL 1. And Brian made CARL very simple. As far as robots go. So Carl has a camera so he can see, so that's his eyes. He will have, within the next few months, microphones in these ears, and then he'll actually hear. He can feel things, so these little sensors can feel when something's a couple feet away. He also has whiskers. I don't know if you could see him, but he has a couple whiskers. He can move around with his wheels autonomously, and his head can swivel back and forth. And what makes it interesting is Carl has this room with a bunch of light panels. And this was, this is about August 2008, so when Brian first got this floor working. And it really got me, once I saw it working, thinking about the movie Saturday Night Fever. So these light panels can flash one of 6 different lights. The light panels can also send signals. Do that. It's not, you got the idea. So the light panels can actually send like one of 6 different colors. We can program it flexibly, so we can make all sorts of things. We have a 5x5 grid now of these. And the light panels can also talk to the robot. So that's important. So if Carl is on a panel, it can say, hey, you're on something good. That's like a juicy reward. Or if Carl's on another panel, they say, hey, that's something bad. That's like a strong electric shock. You better move off that. And so we can do with total flexibility, use the same robot, and we're using several experiments with this. And I'll show you 2 that we're using with just this setup. Okay, so we made a model, a simplified model of these areas, but the models of the areas of the serotonin system, which is important for dealing with risky behavior. And so if the serotonin system is on, it's going to drive you to move away from that because that's something costly or risky. And the dopaminergic system, which is that area for rewarding stuff. So if the dopamine system's on, then it's going to make you find something. And now, how do you do what's good and what's bad? Well, the floor is telling you what's good and what's bad. And this basal forebrain, as I said, is actually helping the attention. So there's attention in this robot. So it actually, if the situation is difficult, this basal forebrain comes on to say, you really got to work harder at this problem. So what is Carl's task? Well, Carl's task is to figure out which colors out of these 4 is predictive of good and which colors are predictive of bad. And so when I say that, I just run Carl in the lab and in a setup like this and just allow him to explore. And Carl will just explore, and the world will tell him what's good, what's bad, and he has to learn the rest. And so it takes Carl, we ran Carl for about 15 minutes in this task. And what you'll see on the right, I should probably set this up. What you'll see on the right is areas of Carl's brain. So these are, I've labeled them areas of the brain that respond to different colors: green, cyan, magenta, red. And areas of the brain that cause him to do actions, find things, flee things. And then these are the areas that are the neuromodulatory areas, so good value and bad value. All right? And so watch these areas as Carl's doing this task and see which colors Carl likes and doesn't like. So Carl just cruises around, looks for things to find. And now this panel's turned red, and Carl's learned that's bad. So that's about as close as Carl gets to the red panel. But he keeps his eye on it because he wants to keep his eye. It's risky, but now it turned green. You see Carl actually cruises over there. And now once he's there, he's getting reward from the thing. So if Carl had a mouth or whatever, he'd be actually getting that juicy drink. And if you look at Carl's brain area, and I'll kind of give you a little robot brain neuroscience lesson in a moment, but there's some interesting activities going on here. And so when it goes some color he doesn't care about, he just cruises away. Okay, so what's going on? So here's Carl just before he sees that red spot. And if you look at these areas of the brain, they're kind of what I would say tonically active. They're active like 25% of the amount they could be. If they turn bright red, they're 100% active. And if they turn dark blue, they're not. It's like the brain went quiet. So here's Carl. He's looking at red. He's not really decisive yet. And then this part of his brain, this neuromodulatory area of his brain comes on, causes him to strongly want to do this runaway behavior and also strongly look at what's important in the world. So he's like focused on the red thing. And if you look at, and if you work with robots and cameras, you see there's tons of noise on these things. And it's worse than our eyes are amazing compared to artificial eyes. So there's tons of noise on this. And when this system comes on, all that noise goes away. So basically, all the noise in the world drops out, and Carl is focused on his task, and all distractors are just come right out. So we think we found areas of the brain that actually, not only I thought it would be important for making decisions, but actually really do what's known as the signal-to-noise problem, really cause what's important to be really focused on and distractors to drop out. So I think we're on to something there. And in the interest of time, let's see, we have 10 minutes. I'll tell you a little bit about a task, and then I'll show you one. Oh, do you have a question? Sure.
You asked for questions along the way.
Absolutely, yeah.
I just wonder, how is this getting recorded?
Oh, that's a good question. I should tell a little bit about the setup. So Carl is actually a small robot, and he's in a lab, so we can actually have Carl do all the kind of sensing and moving, and then he's wirelessly sending information to a workstation that's a few feet away from him that has a really good computer. And this computer is got his whole brain that I showed you, which is about, small by brain standards, 10,000 neurons and about 1 million connections between those neurons. And at every 30 milliseconds, we're updating what Carl's brain is doing, every single neuron, and then we're saving every single neuron on the hard drive of that computer.
How are they called neurons?
They're called neurons because we're mathematically modeling. I didn't want to show all the equations. We're mathematically modeling equations that mimic the dynamics of a neuron. So it's an artificial neuron, you're correct to say. So the neurons in a computer language, and the fact that it's on a computer and all the connections are labeled on the computer means we have access to it and means we can save it. So we have this whole life record of what's going on in his brain during this period. And I should give you one other caveat is no two brains are ever alike in real brains, and no two brains are ever alike in any robot system I've ever seen. So experience really matters. So very shortly after I put him in the environment, things change, its behavior changes, they have personalities. We have some that are fast learners, some that are slow learners, some that are perseverating. You start talking to your robot too, like, why aren't you getting it? And some of them learn too fast. So you get all that. Yeah, question in the back.
Robot that cleans the floor.
Oh, the Roomba,
And
right?
That robot.
Yeah.
Robo. And he's fabulous. And is this similar? I mean, he seems to have a pattern. He goes in through each room, and he does a marvelous job.
Yeah, we take a lot of inspiration from that group. There's really very little brains on that robot. The people that designed it were very clever. They wanted to do the opposite of the chess playing. They wanted to have a very simple system that could do seemingly very smart things by interacting with the environment. So for the the robot vacuum cleaner, it's being able to run a random pattern and not get stuck in corners. And you look at it, it goes, wow, that robot's really smart. So we have actually a lot of that low-level stuff that they did because we follow that work, and then we put our brain on top of that. Yeah. Yeah.
Just so I can put this in context of what's going on microphone.
Or I can repeat it if you don't want the mic.
I thought everybody. Okay. Just so I could put this in context of what's going on in the world, what is the most advanced robot right now? Because I don't know if what you're showing us is specific to UCI study as opposed to where the universe of this development has gone.
Okay, good question. So robotics is a huge area, and this is a subset of robotics. And I think we're on the leading edge. And actually, I'm editing a book with a fellow in Japan. Japan also is doing really nice work. And we looked around the world, and we found less than 20 labs in the world doing stuff that's like this, doing brain models and putting it on robots. And we were fortunate to get about 12 of these groups to actually agree to write a chapter in this book. We're far behind some of the application robots like Roomba, some of the military applications that are unmanned vehicles, but they're very brittle. And a lot of people have realized that. The conventional way you're doing robots can do a lot of things, but they can only do one thing at a time, and they can't adjust out of that. They're not adaptive. So a lot of people are interested in using this maybe initially as sort of on top of a rigid system to make it more adaptive, to make it learn from its environment, make it learn through experience. Current robots don't do that, but current robots for manufacturing, picking up things, or navigate. I watched a race of robots through the desert, the autonomous cars racing through the desert, so they can do a lot of things really well right now. But we've got a long way to go.
You see robots.
Actually, why don't I finish up and then we'll take lots of questions. Because I just want one more story to go. Is another interesting area of robotics is human-robot interaction. So I see robots, and a lot of people see robots actually out there, and we want to be able to interact with them. So we want them to be safe, and we want them to understand our needs. And actually, it's an interesting area of research, and we wanted to get into it in a sort of neuroscience way. So we wanted to look at how well you cooperate and compete for things. And so we came up with a game that economists play, which is called the hawk-dove game. And the idea of the hawk-dove game is that there's a resource out there, and it's worth something. And so you and I could go up to that resource, and we could share it. We could both be dovish. And we share it, and then we split the resource in half. Or you could go up there, and I come up, and I go, I'm going to be hawkish. I'm going to fight for the resource and just take it away from you. I get the whole thing. Then you say, that's not fair. And you come up, and we go to the resource, and we both fight. Unfortunately, we both get hurt. Now, one of us might get hurt badly. One of us might get hurt just with a scratch, but we both get hurt. And so there's this play between cooperation and competition. You get a bigger reward if you fight for something, but you actually risk getting hurt. And so we made a model of this, and I don't want to go into too much detail. The model showed nice behavior that if the environment was friendly, where you don't get many serious injuries, our robot became quite aggressive. If every time it got a fight, it got very seriously injured, our robot actually became quite cooperative and shy. If it played against a player who was super aggressive, it backed down and actually cooperated more. If it played against a milquetoast kind of opponent, it took advantage of it. So this model, which was based on the serotonin system and the dopamine system, actually could learn these interesting behaviors between cooperation and competing. So we decided to set up a study, and we have people coming through our lab, and without going into too much detail, we actually changed their diet the day before so they don't have protein, and we give them a shake, the worst tasting milkshake you can imagine, but it has all the amino acids except for one called tryptophan, and tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin. So by the end of the day, their serotonin levels in their brain have crashed. And then at the end after we have them run our study, they eat a steak and they're back to normal. So it's a very quick way to actually change their brain chemistry. So we have them come in the lab and play against Carl. in this game. And so here's the setup, just to show you how we use the floor for a different setup. So playing this game, you can play against the computer, and the colors mean the resource. And so if the resource is magenta, that means it's open. When it turns green, that means someone picked a fight. And here's the setup. This is Andrew Zaldivar, that's his head, and Derek Asher. They worked on this game and run all the subjects. And you see Carl sees the magenta. Andrew just picked a fight, turned it red. And so Carl's thinking about, like, what should I do? And he roams around. Now he looks ready to make a decision. And so he sees the color red. He knows that Andrew's picked a fight. And so what does Carl want to do? So he goes up, and Carl has the ability to change the color of the panels too. And so Carl says, all right, well, you picked a fight. Well, I'm going to fight right back. And so he turns it green. And so that means they fought. And now they both got hurt. So now Andrew goes, all right, well, I'm going to be nice. So he changes it to blue. Blue means I'm going to cooperate. Carl goes over, says, well, if you're going to be nice, I'll be nice too. And so Carl actually chooses to cooperate. So we've run 9 different people through this, having them through all the various conditions. We're just getting to the data and getting through it, but it looks really interesting. We're seeing all sorts of effects with how you react to the computer versus just the robot versus the computer, how you react to changing your brain chemistry, difference between strategies, male and female. So there's tons of stuff we're going to uncover with this study. Okay, so now it's time to wrap up, I'd say. Let me show you all the people that actually do the work. So Andrew Zaldivar and Derek Asher, where's Derek? There he is. Derek do the human studies and set up the game. Professor Lisa Brewer in cognitive science is also an MD, and she's been extremely helpful with setting up the study and running human subjects. I've never worked with humans actually before in a study. It's a daunting task, so I don't know how I could have done it without her. Brian Cox made Carl and the floor. Liam Bucci now is actually taking care of like Carl and making the next generation of Carl and some new materials. And there's a whole cast of characters I didn't get to talk about all the new stuff that we're doing in the lab. So anyway, the final word is the brain is a body, the body is embedded in the environment. So the brain has this closed loop coupling that with what its body telling it, what the environment is doing, and working very, very closely together. And we've been doing this to understand how the brain works. I think we've developed a really powerful tool, but there's a flip side to this. I think robots are brittle. They can only work so well, but we have a working model, and that's our brain. So I think the only way to get to the robots on the right of this picture is actually to follow the working model and try and reverse engineer how our brain works, and then we'll get machines that are truly intelligent. So thank you very much for your attention.